Some photographs capture more than just a moment in time. They preserve secrets, mysteries, and sometimes the unthinkable. What you're about to hear is the true story of a single photograph that changed everything for one family 100 years after it was taken. This is a tale of discovery, obsession, and the chilling truth that sometimes lies hidden in plain sight. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss our chilling stories that will keep you awake at night. The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet streets of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, as Margaret Chen carefully arranged the vintage photographs on her grandmother's dining table. The year was 2010, and she had just inherited her late grandmother's house along with decades of family memorabilia. Margaret, a 3-4-year-old librarian with a passion for genealogy, had taken a week off work to sort through the countless boxes that filled the attic. Her grandmother, Elenina Wittman, had been the family historian, meticulously preserving photographs, letters, and documents dating back to the 1802. Among the treasures was a formal family portrait that immediately caught Margaret's attention. The sepia-toned photograph showed the Wittman family posed outside their stately Victorian home in 1910. 5 family members stood in a rigid line. Patriarch Thomas Wittman, his wife Catherine, their 3 children, and what appeared to be a family friend or distant relative. Margaret studied the photograph with the keen eye of someone trained in historical research. The composition was typical of the era, formal, staged with everyone looking directly at the camera with serious expressions. The Victorian house behind them was magnificent, with its wraparound porch, ornate woodwork, and perfectly manicured garden. Everything seemed perfectly normal for a prosperous American family at the turn of the century. She set the photograph aside and continued sorting through the collection. Hours passed as she organized documents by decade, creating neat piles of birth certificates, marriage licenses, and newspaper clippings. The autumn afternoon was growing dim when she decided to take a break and examined the 1910 photograph more closely under the bright kitchen light. Margaret pulled out a magnifying glass she'd inherited along with everything else, and began examining every detail of the image. She noted the intricate details of her great-great-grandmother's dress, the formal suits worn by the men, and the pristine condition of the house's exterior. It was then that she noticed something odd about the house's front window. In the upper right corner, barely visible through the reflection on the glass, there appeared to be a face. At first, Margaret assumed it was simply a reflection, or perhaps one of the family members had moved during the long exposure time required for photographs in that era. But as she adjusted the magnifying glass and changed the angle of the light, the face became more distinct. It was definitely a person, but not one of the 5 individuals posed outside. This was someone else, someone watching from inside the house. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She'd spent years studying historical photographs, and something about this hidden figure didn't sit right with her. The face appeared to be that of a young woman, pale and gaunt, with dark circles around her eyes. But what disturbed Margaret most was the expression. It wasn't curiosity or mild interest in the photograph being taken outside. It was fear. Over the next several days, Margaret found herself obsessing over the photograph. She scanned it at high resolution and used photo editing software to enhance the contrast and brightness around the window area. The more she manipulated the image, the clearer the hidden face became. It was definitely a young woman, probably in her late teens or early 22nd, and she appeared to be pressing her face against the glass, as if trying to get someone's attention. Margaret began researching her family's history more intensively. She visited the local historical society, pored over old city directories, and even tracked down surviving relatives who might have information about the Wittman family in 1910. What she discovered began to paint a troubling picture. According to city records, Thomas Wittman had been a successful businessman who owned several properties around Cedar Rapids. He was known in the community as a pillar of society, active in local politics and charitable organizations. However, Margaret also found several curious entries in local newspapers from that period. There were brief mentions of domestic disturbances at the Wittman residence, though no details were provided. More disturbing were the hospital records she managed to access through her connections at the library. Between 1908 and 1912, there were several admissions of young women to the local psychiatric facility, all listing Thomas Wittman as the responsible party. The women were described as domestic staff suffering from hysteria and nervous disorders. Margaret's research took on an urgent quality as she began to piece together a darker narrative. She discovered that Thomas Wittman had a reputation for hiring young immigrant women as household staff, often girls who had no family in America and spoke little English. These women would work for the Wittman family for periods ranging from several months to a few years before disappearing from all records. The breakthrough came when Margaret found a handwritten letter tucked inside an old Bible that had belonged to her great-great-grandmother, Catherine. The letter, dated 1911, was from Catherine to her sister in Chicago. In it, Catherine expressed her growing concern about her husband's treatment of the household staff. She wrote about hearing crying and screaming from the servants' quarters late at night and her husband's insistence that she never go to the third floor of their house. "Thomas has changed," Catherine wrote in her careful script. "He speaks of discipline and order, but I fear there is something darker at work. The girls who come to work for us arrive hopeful and leave broken, if they leave at all. I have asked him about Mary, the Irish girl who worked for us last spring, and he claims she returned to her family in Boston, but I found her belongings hidden in the cellar. Thomas, I found them, and I am afraid." Margaret's hands shook as she read the letter. Mary. She immediately returned to the photograph and studied the face in the window with new eyes. Could this be Mary, the Irish girl Catherine had written about? Was she trapped in the house trying to signal for help while the family posed for their portrait outside? The implications were horrifying. If Margaret's suspicions were correct, her great-great-grandfather had been holding young women against their will, possibly subjecting them to abuse, or worse. The formal family portrait intended to project an image of respectability and success had inadvertently captured evidence of his crimes. Margaret contacted Dr. James Morrison, a forensic photographer who specialized in historical image analysis. She met him at his office in downtown Cedar Rapids on a gray November morning, the original photograph carefully protected in an archival sleeve. Dr. Morrison was a thin, methodical man in his 52nd who had worked on numerous cold cases for law enforcement agencies across the Midwest. He examined the photograph under various types of lighting and used specialized equipment to analyze the density and composition of different areas of the image. "This is definitely a human face," he confirmed after an hour of analysis. "The positioning and the way the light falls across the features rules out any possibility of it being a reflection or artifact from the photographic process. Someone was deliberately positioned at this window, and they appear to be in some form of distress." Dr. Morrison pointed to specific details he had observed. "Notice the way her hands are positioned against the glass. This isn't casual observation. This is someone trying to get attention. And look at her mouth. It appears to be open, as if she's calling out, though of course we can't hear what she might have been saying." Armed with this professional confirmation, Margaret felt compelled to take her investigation further. She contacted the Cedar Rapids Police Department and was referred to Detective Lisa Rodriguez, who specialized in cold cases. Detective Rodriguez was initially skeptical. After all, Margaret was asking her to investigate a crime that may have occurred over a century ago. However, the detective's interest was piqued when Margaret showed her the enhanced photographs and the letter from Catherine Wittman. "We've had cases where historical evidence has led to the discovery of previously unknown crimes," Detective Rodriguez explained. "And if there are victims, they deserve to have their stories told, regardless of how much time has passed." Detective Rodriguez arranged for a ground-penetrating radar survey of the property where the Wittman house had once stood. The original Victorian mansion had been demolished in the 1962nd, replaced by a small apartment complex. The current owners, curious about the property's history, gave permission for the non-invasive survey. Margaret stood in the parking lot on a cold December morning, watching as technicians moved the radar equipment across the ground in careful grids. The process was methodical and time-consuming, with the team paying special attention to areas that would have been beneath the original house's foundation. By afternoon, the technicians had made a disturbing discovery. The radar detected several anomalies in the soil consistent with unmarked graves. The anomalies were located in what would have been the house's backyard, near where historical records indicated there had once been a small garden shed. We found at least 4 distinct disturbances in the soil. The lead technician reported to Detective Rodriguez and Margaret. The depth and size of these anomalies are consistent with human burial sites. They appear to have been undisturbed since they were created, which would be consistent with your timeline. The discovery sent shock waves through the small Cedar Rapids community. Local newspapers picked up the story, and Margaret found herself at the center of a media storm she had never anticipated. The headline in the Cedar Rapids Gazette read, "Family photo leads to discovery of century-old crime scene." Margaret struggled with the sudden attention and the weight of what she had uncovered. Her quiet week of sorting through family memorabilia had led to the potential discovery of multiple murders. She found herself unable to sleep, haunted by the face in the window and the thought of what those young women must have endured. Dr. Sarah Williams, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Iowa, was brought in to oversee the excavation process. She explained to Margaret that even after a century, it was possible to recover significant evidence from the burial sites. Bones preserve well in Iowa soil, Dr. Williams explained as they walked around the excavation site. We'll be able to determine age, sex, and cause of death. In many cases, if there was trauma to the bones, we'll be able to document it. And personal effects, jewelry, clothing fasteners, dental work can help us identify the victims. The excavation began in January 2011, conducted with the care and precision of an archaeological dig. Margaret visited the site regularly, drawn by a need to bear witness to the recovery of these forgotten victims. Each day brought new discoveries that painted an increasingly horrific picture of Thomas Wittman's crimes. The first complete skeleton was that of a young woman, probably in her late teens. She was buried wearing a simple dress with brass buttons, and a locket was found around her neck. Inside the locket was a photograph of an elderly couple, presumably her parents. Dr. Williams determined that the young woman had suffered multiple fractures to her ribs and skull, indicating severe physical abuse before her death. This level of trauma suggests sustained violence over an extended period. Dr. Williams explained to Margaret and Detective Rodriguez, this wasn't a single incident. This was systematic abuse that ultimately led to her death. As the excavation continued, 3 more bodies were recovered. All were young women. All showed signs of physical trauma, and all had been buried hastily in shallow graves. Personal effects found with the bodies included letters written in various languages: Irish, Gaelic, Italian, and what appeared to be Polish. These letters, when translated, told heartbreaking stories of young women who had come to America seeking better lives, only to find themselves trapped in a nightmare. One letter found with the 3rd victim was particularly haunting. Written in Italian and addressed to Mia Familia, my dear family, it read, "I am writing this in secret, hidden in the place where they keep us. The man who promised work and safety has become our jailer. We are not allowed to leave, and those who try are punished severely. I fear I will never see home again. If something happens to me, know that I tried to be brave." Margaret realized that the face in the window, the woman she now believed was Mary, the Irish girl mentioned in Catherine's letter, might have been the only victim to leave behind photographic evidence of her captivity. The formal family portrait, meant to showcase Thomas Wittman's success and respectability, had inadvertently documented one of his crimes. The investigation revealed that Thomas Wittman had used his position in the community to prey on vulnerable immigrant women. He would offer them employment through networks of other Irish, Italian, and Polish immigrants, promising good wages and safe working conditions. Once the women arrived at his house, however, they found themselves imprisoned, forced to work without pay, and subjected to physical and sexual abuse. Detective Rodriguez's investigation into historical records revealed that Wittman had connections to several other prominent families in the area who may have been involved in similar schemes. The exploitation of immigrant domestic workers was apparently more widespread than anyone had previously known. What we're looking at here is an early form of human trafficking, Detective Rodriguez explained at a press conference. These women were lured to Cedar Rapids with false promises, then held against their will and ultimately killed. The fact that this went undetected for over a century speaks to the vulnerability of immigrant communities during this period of American history. Margaret found herself grappling with the knowledge that her own family history was intertwined with these horrific crimes. She struggled with guilt, despite knowing that she bore no responsibility for her ancestors' actions. The discovery had turned her understanding of her family legacy upside down. She reached out to descendant communities of Irish, Italian, and Polish immigrants in Cedar Rapids, offering to help identify the victims and return them to their families for proper burial. The response was overwhelming, with dozens of families coming forward with stories of ancestors who had disappeared after coming to work in American households. Through DNA analysis and genealogical research, Dr. Williams and Margaret were able to identify 3 of the 4 victims. Mary O'Brien, the Irish girl mentioned in Catherine's letter and likely the face in the window, was identified through records from Ellis Island and DNA comparison with living relatives in Ireland. Her great-niece, Kathleen O'Brien Murphy, travelled from Dublin to attend her burial. For over a century, our family wondered what happened to Mary, Kathleen said through tears at the memorial service. We knew she had gone to America, but then her letters stopped coming. Now we know she never forgot us. She was trying to get home until the very end. The other identified victims were Sofia Rossetti, an 8-year-old from southern Italy, and Anna Kowalski, a 20-year-old from a small village outside Kov. Both had living relatives who were notified through the consular services of their respective countries. The 4th victim remained unidentified, but she was buried alongside the others in a section of Cedar Rapids Oak Hill Cemetery donated by the city. The headstone read, "Unknown Sister. She is not forgotten." Margaret donated the original 1910 photograph to the Cedar Rapids Historical Society, where it became the centerpiece of an exhibition about immigration and exploitation in early 20th century Iowa. The exhibition drew visitors from around the world, many of whom had similar stories of ancestors who had disappeared after immigrating to America. The story had profound effects beyond the immediate community. Immigration historians began researching similar cases across the Midwest, leading to the discovery of several other instances of systematic exploitation and murder of immigrant domestic workers. The case became a touchstone for discussions about historical justice and the hidden stories of America's immigrant communities. Margaret eventually returned to her work as a librarian, but she also became an advocate for immigrant rights and historical justice. She established the Mary O'Brien Foundation, which provides resources for genealogical research and victim identification in historical cases involving immigrant exploitation. "Every photograph tells a story," Margaret said in an interview with the Cedar Rapids Gazette 1 year after the discovery. "Sometimes those stories are beautiful celebrations of family and achievement, but sometimes they preserve evidence of injustice and suffering that needs to be brought to light, no matter how much time has passed." The foundation worked with law enforcement agencies across the country to develop protocols for investigating historical crimes, particularly those involving vulnerable populations who might not have had the resources or language skills to report abuse at the time it occurred. Dr. Williams continued her forensic work, but also became involved in training programs for law enforcement officers on recognizing and investigating historical crimes. She emphasized the importance of taking seriously any evidence, no matter how old, that might shed light on past injustices. "Science gives us the tools to speak for those who can no longer speak for themselves," she said. "Every skeleton we recover, every artifact we analyze is an opportunity to restore dignity to someone whose story was cut short." The case also led to changes in how historical societies and museums approached their collections. Many institutions began reviewing their photograph archives with new eyes, looking for potential evidence of historical crimes or exploitation that had been overlooked for decades. Detective Rodriguez, now retired, occasionally speaks at law enforcement conferences about the importance of interdisciplinary cooperation in solving cold cases. She credits Margaret's genealogical skills and persistence, combined with modern forensic techniques, as key to solving a case that had remained hidden for over a century. "This case taught me that justice doesn't have a statute of limitations," Rodriguez said. "When we recover the remains of victims and tell their stories, we honor their memory and provide closure for their families, even if that closure comes 100 red years later." Margaret kept only one item from her grandmother's collection, a small silver locket that had belonged to her great-great-grandmother. Catherine. Inside, she placed a photograph of the 4 identified victims restored to dignity through proper burial and remembrance. She wore the locket as a daily reminder of the responsibility that comes with preserving family history, the obligation to tell the complete story, not just the parts that reflect well on our ancestors. The apartment complex that now stands where the Wittman house once stood installed a memorial plaque near the entrance. It reads, "In memory of Mary O'Brien, Sophia Rossetti, Anna Kowalski, and their unnamed sister, victims of exploitation and violence, they are remembered and honored. Their stories will not be forgotten." Every year on the anniversary of the discovery, Margaret visits the memorial with flowers and photographs of the victims.